Today we continue and complete the discussion of the progressive project in political economy, the progressive approach to the supply side of the economy. We've discussed the relation of rearguards to vanguards, that is the path from the insular knowledge economy that we have today, a knowledge economy for the few, to a knowledge economy for the many, and the relation of labor to capital and the conditions under which free labor could become really free. Now we come to the third topic that I brought under this heading of a progressive political economy, the democratization of the market order, which is the relation of finance to the real economy, and especially the relation of finance to the productive agenda of society. And then later in the class, in the second part of the class, I hope to turn to the next major theme in the argument of the course, democracy, and the creation of a high-energy democracy. So the central idea in the established conventional view of finance is that a perfectly competitive capital market allocates resources to their most efficient use. If there is a problem, if there is a failure in efficiency, the failure must be attributed to some specific localized flaw in competition, which may include, of course, some failure of symmetry of information, or else a flaw in the equally targeted regulatory response to this localized competitive flaw. What that view excludes is the possibility that lies at the heart of my discussion now. Namely, that finance can be more or less closely linked to the real economy. It can be enlisted or fail to be enlisted in the service of the productive agenda of society. Its objects of concern and ambition may be the transactions of the real economy, or it may use the transactions of the real economy as only a pretext to serve itself rather than to serve this productive agenda. So on this other view, that is the view that's excluded by the mainstream approach, a contrast must be drawn between what I want to call financial hypertrophy and financial deepening. This contrast presupposes the variability of the relation between finance and the real economy, that it is a variable and not a constant. Financial hypertrophy is the expansion of finance, finance external to the real economy, absorbing more and more profit and more talent from the society, but minimizing its contribution to the real agenda of production. Financial deepening, by contrast, is the embedding of finance in the real economy and its enlistment in the service of production. That contrast makes no sense in the vocabulary of the conventional established view, but it is central to the arguments that I now make. Another word for financial hypertrophy, a more conventional word, would be financialization. And when the contemporary market economies are said to be financialized, what that means is that there is this bloating of finance coexisting with the minimization of its contribution to the agenda of production. The exclusion of that possibility, that is the possibility of this variable relation between finance and the real economy, has been both expressed and aggravated by the conventional approach to the regulation of finance. In the run-up to the financial crisis of 2008 and in the aftermath, the dominant strategy of the regulation of finance, the dominant regulatory strategy in the latter part of the 20th century, a strategy that continues to this day, really largely undisturbed, is the strategy that we could call regulatory dualism. The idea of regulatory dualism is that we can distinguish two sectors of finance. A thickly regulated sector, which is used by the general public, and a thinly regulated sector, which is inhabited by financial professionals and high net worth individuals. And the idea of regulatory dualism is animated by an argument of paternalism. So, in the thickly regulated sector, the ordinary consumers of finance supposedly need protection. But in the thinly regulated sector, populated by the financial professionals and the high net worth individuals, this protection can be dispensed with. What happened in the run-up to the crisis of 2008 is that many of the financial products and services that were prohibited in the thickly regulated sector were repackaged and then sold, disseminated in the thinly regulated sector. So then this strategy, this wall that was supposed to exist between the thick and the thin was circumvented. And that was one of the proximate causes of the financial troubles of 2007 and 2008. Then in the aftermath of that crisis, various strategies of re-regulation of finance were proposed and to some extent implemented. The common view was that we failed because we failed adequately to regulate finance. We must re-regulate finance. And then there were 4 programs that resulted. One was attempts that were never really achieved or translated into law to reinstate the Glass-Steagall distinction, the distinction of the Banking Act of 1935 in the United States, between commercial banking and investment banking, between banks that rely on federally insured deposits and banks that do proprietary trading with their own assets. That was the first program. It was a move in that direction, which was not in fact consummated. The second was a new technocratic agenda to increase the power of the federal government to wind up and reconstruct failing financial organizations. A technocratic agenda of resolution and liquidation authority vested in the federal government. The third strategy of financial regulation was the strategy embraced by the international financial elite, the elite of high finance in the world, headquartered in the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. And its focus was to increase the capital adequacy requirements for the banks, to say that they would have to have a higher level of capital as a safeguard against troubles like the troubles of 2008. And finally, the fourth strategy was the consumer protection strategy, which in the United States resulted in the establishment of the Finance Consumer Protection Bureau in the aftermath of the crisis of 2008. Now, what is notable is that none of these four strategies addressed what I just claimed to be the central question, the question of the contrast between financial deepening and financial hypertrophy. None of them sought to tighten the relationship between finance and production. None of them tried to enlist finance more effectively in the service of production under the thesis that the best way to make finance less dangerous would be to make it more useful. And in fact, and this is perhaps the most astonishing aspect of the experiences and debates of the recent past in finance, none of the reforms or the ideas about reforms even challenged the strategy of regulatory dualism. So the strategy of regulatory dualism, which was one of the most proximate influences on the breaking out of the crisis, on the outbreak of the crisis, was left unreplaced, unchallenged by all of these debates and all of these reforms of that recent period. Now, before proceeding further then, and trying to develop the central idea, the idea that the task is to increase the usefulness of finance to the productive agenda of society, let me distinguish three worlds of finance and of business in the contemporary market economies, as illustrated by the United States. In this respect, the United States is not an exception. The situation is much the same in the other advanced market economies. The first world is a world of the large, successful, mature firms, the capital-intensive businesses that typically have massive pools of liquid capital. They're not customers of the banks to obtain finance on the whole, but they are frequenters of the financial markets. They're actors in the financial markets. They act in the financial markets to make financial gains, not to borrow money, typically. So, for example, stock buybacks, ways of enriching their own managers and stockholders and so forth. That's one world in which, as it were, the relation between the productive enterprises and finance is turned upside down because finance becomes simply one more source for gain. The second world is the world of the relatively backward small and medium-sized firms, family business, typically based, as I've said in an earlier class, on self-exploitation and family saving. These backward firms do go occasionally to the banks, both to the national banks and to the local retail banks, for lending, for borrowing, even though most of the finance of their production, as I just suggested, is generated from the inside. But from the standpoint of the lenders, this financing of production by the small and medium-sized firms is relatively unimportant. It is vastly overshadowed by the combination of consumer credit card and mortgage finance, which is the main lending business of the commercial banks throughout the world in all of the advanced economies. Now, the third world is the world of the smaller, typically smaller, not always smaller, but typically smaller, disruptive, highly innovative enterprises that are engaged not in efficiency-enhancing innovations, which are marginal and capital-saving, but in major disruptive, transformative innovations, which are typically capital-intensive. They are clients of finance, especially of venture capital and its associated forms. But in every major country of the world, as I've said before, and I'll say again, represents a minuscule part of the total activity of finance. So that's a description, as it were, of the economic geography of finance, of the map of these three different sectors of business and their differential relation to the banks. Now, in order to develop the argument, what I want to do is to fix on what I think are the three great enigmas that are presented to us in the understanding of the relation of finance to the real economy. The first enigma is an enigma of superfluity. So there's all that money in the banks and the stock markets, all of that liquid capital. The simple, disquieting question is, what is it for? Supposedly, it's to finance the productive agenda of society. In fact, we know that the vast preponderance of the financing of production is internally generated within the production system itself on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. Capital spending as an accounting category is a proxy for the measurement of the financing of production. And capital spending, the financing of production, over 90% of it, or at least over 80% of it, and in most times well over 90% of it, has been internally generated within the productive enterprises themselves. So then you can ask the question, the artless question. What then is the point of all of that money? Now, it can have an episodic relation to the financing of production. For example, initial public offers on the stock market. Or it can have an oblique relation to the financing of production. You can say the trading of shares on the stock market establishes a benchmark of value against which the corporations might borrow. It's a theoretical argument. They might borrow. If they did borrow, on the whole, they don't borrow. Supposedly this benchmark of value is necessary to the borrowing that they would undertake. So that's the first enigma. And the answer to that enigma, from the standpoint of the argument that I just anticipated about deepening as the alternative to hypertrophy, is that most of that capital outside liquid capital is in fact pointless from the standpoint of production. And the reason is that financial hypertrophy has prevailed over financial deepening. The second enigma has to do with an asymmetry. Finance is relatively indifferent to the real economy in good times The real economy is financing itself, with the exception of that small minority of smaller scale, highly disruptive, capital-starved enterprises that I described as the third world of finance. But for the most part, in good times, the businesses are generating the finance of production from inside themselves on the basis of retained and reinvested earnings. And then in bad times, there's trouble, there's financial crisis, financial instability, and the financial instability spills over the frontiers of the finance system and begins to threaten real economic activity. So it's easy to understand why finance has a problem, and there are two initial explanations of this proclivity to financial instability, which can in turn then disrupt the real economy. The first is that finance doesn't control the institutional context in which it operates. It doesn't even control the exercise of monetary policy. So the institutional context is shaped by, in politics, and then expressed in law and in policy, and of course, finance tries to influence or even to buy influence on policy and law, but it's always vulnerable to the formation of the institutional context from outside. The second explanation is the explanation that was emphasized by Keynes. Liquid capital, because of its very liquidity, the facility with which it can be moved around, easily bears the imprint of our humors, of our cycles of elation and despondency, of hope and greed. And so it serves, according to this psychological strand in English political economy, as the instrument of our own instability. So that's the beginning of an explanation of this phenomenon. But of course you might say that the phenomenon is variable for the same reasons that I've been suggesting. That is, the more finance were embedded in the real economy, the less the transactions of the real economy were just a pretext for successive layers of financial engineering, the less likely it would be that finance could run on its own motion and serve to express these cycles which would then threaten to disrupt the real economy. Now we come to the third enigma. What is the most important responsibility of finance from the standpoint of the productive agenda of society? The most important responsibility of finance is to fund the creation of new assets in new ways. That is the distinctive responsibility of venture capital and its associated forms of finance. And that activity is tiny in comparison to the total activity of the financial markets, even in those countries, beginning with the United States and Israel, in which venture capital is most prominent. In the United States, for example, venture capital accounts for less than 0.5% of GDP. It's a tiny activity in comparison to the total dimension of the financial markets. And that would be then a dramatic example of this inversion in which financialization, financial hypertrophy, triumphs over financial deepening. So if we want to have a progressive approach to the supply side of the economy, serving a productivist project, we have to reform, we have to redirect the approach to finance. That's the simple argument. And as I say, that argument flies in the face of what I described at the beginning of the class as the conventional view. A perfectly competitive market with untainted by asymmetry of information will allocate resources to their most competitive uses. It will do, it already does what that thought experiment of mine, vesting the productive resources of society in trusts, which then auction off the productive capital of society to their most efficient uses, proposes to do. They say that already happens. So a test of whether that already happens, of course, would be to have some version of this thought experiment and compare its results to what already happens. Now then, animated by these ideas, what kind of a program would one have? What would be the initial steps? So the initial steps would be negative and positive. The negative step would be to discourage or outright prohibit forms of financial engineering that make no plausible contribution to the expansion of output and the rise of productivity. So, you can give the example of options contracts, derivatives of the property right, which are, after all, the mainstay of the contemporary financial markets. They had an undoubted function in what was their original context, commodity markets, where they helped to increase liquidity. But it seems that in equity markets, they have been converted from being antidotes to gambling into being devices of gambling, the very opposite. And then the case for them would be much less great. Or take, for example, the secondary mortgage market that was part of the source of the financial crisis of 2008. So the initial mortgages were repackaged and they sold off. And so the transactions of the real economy that motivated the business were further and further away. Successive layers of higher layers were then superimposed on the original transactions of the real economy. So the further away the real thing becomes from the financial engineering, the more the real subject of finance begins to be itself. And the original transactions of the real economy were just the pretext to start this train going. So you would say, we'll prohibit all of those transactions that, all of those forms of financial engineering that have no colorable contribution to the expansion of output or of productivity. Now, there is a crucial analytical refinement here. I want to say that this is not per se an argument against speculation, against the speculative element in finance. It is an argument against the disassociation of financial speculation from production, because speculation can serve the positive goal of developing information and organizing the allocation of risk. The problem is not in speculation in itself. The problem is in the disconnection of speculation from production. And then, of course, positive means would be to multiply and deepen the channels from the saving of society and its dormant productive potential and production. So, for example, there's a huge amount of capital in the public and private pension systems of the world. Why not vest them, or part of them, in diversified portfolios for investment in the future? And of course, that would be the traditional way in finance of controlling for risk, diversification. And then you observe the result. So, and that vast capital would cease to be sterile and we would become fertile for the purposes of production. So these would be, as it were, the baby steps, the initial steps by which you might begin to move in a productivist direction in finance. And along the way, in particular countries, you might profit from the examples of the war economy. Like the War Production Board of the Second World War. And even some of the institutions organized before Roosevelt took power by Hoover, like the Refinance Corporation. So the idea is that there would be a public intervention in the mobilization of finance for the purpose of production. And the crucial point is that this would not be a form of discretionary allocation by the government, choosing winners, choosing favorite sectors, distributing resources to some, denying them to others, but this would be conducted as a collective activity separate from the central government by a multiplicity of separate funds or firms managed by professionals and with results that could be competitively and retrospectively observed. Now, if we extended in that direction, if we continued in that direction, we would ultimately come to my thought experiment, that is, to the idea that the major productive resources of society, its liquid capital and technological apparatus, are not definitively owned by anyone or controlled by the government. They are auctioned off to those users who can assure the funds of the highest rate of return over different time horizons with different profiles of risk. And of course, that's just a distant goal, but it's a goal that we can take as marking a direction. So the basic argument I want to make is that some such transformation of finance is an important corollary, an accompaniment to the transformations in the relation of vanguard to rearguard and of labor to capital that I've discussed in other parts of the exposition of this program. So that's, I think, all I want to say now about finance for the moment. Let me stop and ask for your comments and questions. See what the basic idea is. It's a very simple point, that everything in a market economy is an artifact. There is no, this is the central idea, the central analytic premise of all parts of the discussion. There is no single natural and necessary part of the market order. So there can be also no single natural and necessary way of governing the relation of finance to production, the financial part of the market. That too has to be the object of reconstruction. And in that domain, our central objection is simple. It is to tighten the link between finance and production. Yes?
So just pulling on that last bit you said about finance needs to be auctioned off to users who can assure funds of the highest rate of return over different time horizons with different profiles of risk. Would that then suggest that in the case of, say, the United States, you would simply just want to grow the percentage that, say, venture capital consumes of the overall financial market? Like, would that be one,
As opposed to what?
as opposed to what we currently have, which is a majority of the financial markets?
As opposed to?
The majority of finance in this country is more speculation that's not
Trading.
production.
Yes, it's trading. So then that activity, which I said should be the most important responsibility, the creation of new assets in new ways,
And that would be VC.
gets much more backing, yes.
Okay.
But it's an open question, right? Because we're not going to invest only in the disruptive innovation. We're going to invest in everything. We have to invest in the established apparatus also. And it then becomes an object of collective discussion. Should we encourage and support the funds that are creating the new? How should we divide this emphasis and so forth? As opposed to the notion that there's a perpetual motion machine that does this automatically for us. And according to this thesis, which is the orthodox thesis, it already auctions off resources to their most efficient users. But then, of course, you can ask, in what time horizons? Does it sacrifice long-term to short-termism? Does it sacrifice the future to the present and so forth? All of those things are left implicit in the current arrangements, and they would have to come to the fore and be the object of debate under the alternative that I described. So, for example, you could say, well, investing in the long term imposes a price. It limits our ability to finance the existing. Are we willing to pay that price and so forth? Yes.
So I guess there does exist something maybe not nearly as robust, but there are state governments that do have these venture capital arms. There's most recently the American Frontier Fund that is doing something similar for defense and national security. But those are state or government entities, but you're talking about getting private professionals together.
No, let me be clear. So the funds that I'm thinking of they're public, but they're not governmental. That is, they're not agencies of the government. So, and this is a very important clarification so that it doesn't seem that this is a move to suppress the market in favor of the state. It's a move to democratize the market. So what I'm saying is that the major productive assets of society are vested in funds which make it impossible for anyone to be the absolute and eternal controller of those assets. No one can bequeath them, for example, through hereditary transmission of property. Who should use them then? Whoever can use them best. And as a token of that, provide the funds with the highest rate of return. That's the conceptual idea. But of course, the enactment of that conceptual idea generates 1,000 complications. We know that. But I'm saying this is the direction. And so it supposes that there's a space for the collective, which is not the state, not the central government, but our interests. So, and that's why earlier when I initially presented this thought experiment, I described it half facetiously as capitalism without capitalists. Because I said, who are the capitalists under this system? They don't exist. So of course there couldn't be capitalism without capitalists. But this would be what that is. Yes?
Yeah, for me that discussion is a kind of dead end. Because of the failure of the nation states to regulate these funds, if the capital itself have like over $70 trillion in fiscal havens, and in your work, you always affirm the importance of the direction and of the first step.
Yes.
So I want to understand better
The direction.
The direction and the first step.
Well, the first steps that I described were those simple negative and positive measures in this, in which negatively you discourage financial engineering that has no colorable relation to the expansion of output or productivity. And then positively, you multiply the channels from the largely sterile saving of society to production. And that can include many things like these diversified portfolios of investment of money that originates from the public and private pension systems. And those are the funds that would be put under the control of financial professionals, but ultimately guided or directed by the democratic institutions. So you observe the results experimentally, and then you say, what works? How does it work? How much does it cost? And you develop what works, and you abandon what doesn't work. That's a description of the relation of the initial steps to the direction. And the claim I'm making is that if you persist in that direction, the regulative ideal, the idealized outcome to which you come is something like this. The curiosity, as I said, the analytical or ideological curiosity is a defender of the orthodox view of finance wouldn't initially say, but that's a scandalous usurpation of the market. What he would say is that's what we already do, because he thinks that the existing capital markets already allocate resources to their most efficient users. They already are this rotating capital auction. And to the point that part of the orthodox view is that it really doesn't matter who are the original owners of those assets, because if the trading continues long enough, they're going to end up in the hands of their most efficient users. So if someone inherits them, but he doesn't know how to manage them, he's going to lose them. And someone else is going to acquire them. So just let enough time pass, and you'll end up with my thought experiment. So, but I don't think that's what happens, because we have these societies, which are class societies. The market and democracy exist in the context of these class societies, and they don't end up looking like this ideal of the capital auction. Yes?
Just a follow-up question on, you talked about financial hypertrophy versus deepening. I wonder which side do you lie on when you think of, let's say, instruments like shorts, as an example?
Of which?
Of shorts, like short selling.
Yes.
Option-based. One argument, especially in emerging markets, is that short sells need to be declared so that there aren't adverse effects to the economy. But the other argument is primarily around how they can act as a function to regulate the market from being overzealous, right? So I mean, so you have shorts so that you can self-regulate the market itself and not have people who are at the thinly regulated end over-exploiting the market itself. Do you believe that option-based short selling, as an example, will...
I am reluctant to denounce any particular financial product as not related to the productive agenda, because I think arguments can be made, just like the argument you just made, that it has a function. But what I think is that that function should be tested and described, and we should reach a conclusion. And that's why I gave this example of option contracts in commodity markets, where the anti-gambling purpose, the liquidity purpose is very clear, and in equity markets where it's much less clear. So presumably there's a spectrum, and it's along that spectrum that we would have to debate and decide.
Just a very small follow-up. This is, you could argue that short selling isn't really financial deepening, it's more hypertrophy. Should in that case there be external regulation which is government-based, in your opinion?
But external regulation to what purpose?
I mean, should short sales, for instance, be declared in that case? Because it's
Declared
declared before they're made.
declared illegal, you said, or what?
No, declared to the market before they're made.
Uh-huh.
I mean, should that regulation?
So that's an argument of transparency. It could be that in some forms of financial engineering you would outright prohibit. Others you might allow because they have a colorable relation to product. They have a function, but you mitigate their damages by requiring that they be transparent. That would be an example. And of course, very early in this path that I'm describing, you would have to overturn the strategy of regulatory dualism, this business about the two sectors, which hasn't worked, and it's part of a major part of the causal background to what happened in 2007, 2008. So it shouldn't be the case that there can be an official banking sector which is highly regulated, and then a shadow banking sector where you can do undercover all the things that are prohibited in the other one. So then any clever lawyer or financier can repackage the prohibited thing in the thick sector as something that he can then do in the thin sector. That obviously shouldn't be allowed. And so I think that the particular applications of this idea will be debatable, and there will be countervailing arguments, as in the discussion we were just beginning. But I think this is a very definite direction in which you say there's a test. The ultimate test is its utility to production. If it's not useful to production, if there's not a significant argument that it has a use, it shouldn't be allowed. It's an abuse, it's a waste, it's a squandering of the surplus of society, which should serve production. It shouldn't be just a resource that allows people to make gains on top of financial rents. Yes.
I'm wondering, sort of like the first step that you suggested, which is, let's say you identify a class of products which really bears no tangible connection
Yes.
to the real economy, and then what you would do is that you would
Prohibited.
prohibit it.
Uh-huh.
But let's say, I suppose I am king of a country and I can actually prohibit it in this territory, right? Capital is very liquid, it's just going to go to whatever generates the highest rate of return, and that might be those very same products in a different market in another country. And so all that is going to happen when I regulate this product in my market is that I'm now going to have less capital in my market because all the capital is going to go away.
That's the argument about globalization as the straitjacket, right? That ties our hands, that prevents us from doing anything. It's very largely a false argument. And I think the most dramatic example of it is the differing fates of China and Latin America in the late 20th century. So Latin America signed on the dotted line. It did everything that the academic, political, and economic authorities of the North wanted. And the theory was that's how you win the confidence of the financial markets. China did all the opposite. It closed the capital account. It prohibited all sorts of things. It violated every article of the religion of the financial markets. 50 years later, where does the vast preponderance of direct foreign investment go? It goes to China, because in the short run, what counts is the religion. But in the medium to long run, what counts is reality. And so it's the reality of the opportunities for gain in the real economy that count in the long run. Financial arbitrage, you get a little more here than you get there. You buy money at one interest rate here and you sell it or maintain it at another interest rate in some other place. That's like frills. That's not where real high the high activity and the money will be made. So a country would be wise then not to seek to base its future on this marginal arbitrage, but to create the basis for a vibrant production system which will generate real opportunities for gain. That's the main argument. Now, that argument does not exempt us from having a debate about the direction of globalization, because, and so that's the first thesis. The first thesis is, under the present form of globalization, which impose real constraints on what can be done, nevertheless, there's huge room for maneuver. And we know that for a fact because different parts of the world, like Latin America and China, have responded to the same constraints in radically different ways. The Latin American economy has developed a kind of functional equivalent to the gold standard, to the 19th century gold standard, which was open the capital account, acquiesce in a low level of domestic saving, depend on foreign saving, and permit the penetration of the national economy by foreign capital right at the outset of the development process. China did the opposite. Close the capital account, depend on domestic saving rather than foreign saving, use loan capital but prohibit foreign capital from penetrating the production system early on. It's the opposite. And it did it within the same set of constraints. And now we know what the result is. One lost and the other won. Under my principle that in history, rebellion is not always rewarded, but obedience is invariably punished. So that's what we see in that dramatic incident. Now, then we come to the second point. Nevertheless, there has to be a debate about globalization. So this form of globalization that prevails does impose a straitjacket, constraints. We shouldn't call it a straitjacket because, as I say, there is a room for maneuver, but it does impose constraints. One of the constraints that it imposes is because it has developed in a degree which you could, in a direction that you could call institutional maximalism. So the WTO treaties and the multilateral trade agreements, transatlantic and trans-Pacific, which are much more important than the WTO treaties now, all follow this direction that you could call institutional maximalism. That is, they don't just require that the trading countries acquiesce in the market economy, they require a very particular version of the market economy. So, for example, a version of the market economy that outlaws under the label subsidies all the forms of strategic coordination or partnership between government and business that the countries that are now rich used in order to become rich, but that they want to deny to the latecomers. Or the rules of the odious regime of intellectual property, the patent regime that was developed at the end of the 19th century, and that has the result of leaving many of the technological innovations of greatest interest to humanity under the control of a handful of multinational businesses. So they say, we're going to incorporate all of this into the rules of world trade. That's what I'm calling institutional maximalism. Now, institutional maximalism is not necessary. The economists often say it's necessary because otherwise there would be impossible transactions costs. But we know that it's not necessary because the precedent to the WTO regime was the regime of the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And that was characterized by institutional minimalism. Its principle was the greatest possible trade among the economies of the world with the least possible restraint on their institutional experiments, including their experiments in ways of organizing a market economy. And the background to that, over centuries in the West, was the development of commercial law, the law merchant, the law of international trade. The premise of the law merchant was that jurisdictions with widely different ways of organizing their economies could nevertheless trade through international commercial principles and international commercial jurisdiction or arbitration. And that worked, showing that this supposed imperative of harmonization, of uniformity, is not in fact realistic or necessary. That trade is possible on the basis of a wide range of underlying institutional and legal divergence. So the direction, the form of globalization that is now predominant, in fact, imposes this maximalism. We should resist it. Now I say we should resist it. Who's the we? Because this isn't going to be the gift of the international technocracy to the world. It can only happen if down below there are strong national projects, and these strong national projects hit against the limits of the restraints imposed by this institutional maximalism of the world trade regime. And then we rebel against it. Countries in the world ally, they combine, like the BRICS countries now, and they force a change in the regime. That's how the change would happen. So the first step would be these strong national rebellious projects. The second step would be a loosening of the rules of world trade. And then the third step would be the deepening of the national strategies made possible by the loosening of the straitjacket. So that's the dynamic that I'm picturing. But this is good because it allows us to connect this discussion about finance with the discussion about globalization that we're going to have later. Okay, so I shift now to the great topic of democracy, or at least begin it. So, in one sense, democracy has priority. It has primacy over the organization of politics has primacy over all the other areas of institutional transformation. Because after all, the state and the law determine the terms under which all the other domains can change. But there's another sense in which what has primacy is the discussion which we've just had about the progressive productivist project. And the reason is the following. No country reforms its politics and its state in order later to decide what to do with the reform politics and the reform state. That's not how things happen in history. There has to be a struggle over the economic and social direction, and then politics and the state are reformed only when they need to be reformed, not a moment earlier. So it's when the country wants to walk in a certain direction, and it can't, because its form of political life doesn't allow it to do that. That's when there's the reform of politics. So in that sense, the struggle over the direction of the productivist project has primacy. Not a logical primacy like the other one that I argued, but a causal and historical primacy. Because first there has to be this struggle over the direction of national development, and that struggle then requires the reformation of politics. This is the direct opposite of what the enlightened reformers generally think in the world. The way they generally think is the reform of politics is the mother of all reforms. First we do that, and then we'll decide what to do about particular domains. But that's not how things really happen. This reformation of politics happens only in the light of the struggle over the economic and social direction. Now, what then should be the starting point of our discussion of democracy? And I want to make two claims. So, first of all, that theoretically or ideologically, the starting point has to be what we are like now. So in 1819, Benjamin Constant published a famous essay on the liberty of the ancients compared to that of the moderns. And he drew a contrast which up to this day remains the formative contrast in the development of political theory. So he imagines two kinds of society, two kinds of freedom. One is the society in which politics is at the center of life, the citizen. It penetrates all of existence. And there's the model of the mythical ancient Rome or ancient Sparta, in which politics is at the center. And and that's the liberty of the ancients. The ancients were free because they lived in such a state, in such a polis. And the moderns are not like that. The moderns are these flesh and bone individuals who have real interests, and for them, politics is an ecstatic or exceptional activity. It's at the periphery of existence. They're incarnate and they have real desires, sectarian interests, and politics is demoted, and it's these private interests which are at the center, and that requires a different conception of liberty. Now, what I want to say is that in this debate, I believe that we should take decisively the position of Constant's moderns and not of his ancients. Because the idea of the ancients is like the utopian inversion of reality. It's not a real thing. It's not the imagination of a real alternative. It's simply our experience of ourselves, our understanding of ourselves, turned upside down in some way. And that's what you could call bad utopianism. So it's this real individual who exists in this framework. And what should our attitude to him be? That we should make him bigger, little by little. So we shouldn't start from the standpoint that we renounce the flesh and bones, incarnate individual, ravenously pursuing his interests. That's what we start with, and then we expand. Or to change the vocabulary, remember that contrast between two kinds of moves. The ordinary moves we make within a framework of arrangements and assumptions we take for granted, and the extraordinary moves by which from time to time, typically under the provocation of crisis, we challenge or change pieces of this framework. Now, what should we want? We should want to narrow the distance between these two sets of moves so that our ability to challenge and change the framework arises more continuously and naturally out of the normal business of life. And then we can become insiders and outsiders at the same time. We can engage without surrendering. And we are more powerful. We enhance the experience of agency. We're not just the puppets of this structure in which we find ourselves. So that's my first claim, that we have to take the standpoint of, as the point of departure, not as the point of arrival, the liberty of the moderns. Now, the second claim regards another kind of contrast in the history of modern politics. And now it's an institutional contrast rather than an ideological contrast. There's an inner circle and an outer circle. So the inner circle are the established constitutional and institutional arrangements of the existing democracies. All of them representative democracies. And the outer circles are the ideas that the revolutionaries and the leftists have had from time to time about the organization of the state. Now, the leitmotif, the central theme of the outer circle is to replace representative democracy by direct democracy. So, like the idea of a government based on the councils or soviets or popular collectives in revolutionary moments. And the experience of history is unequivocal about this idea. This idea is a feint, a dream, which exists only in these moments of revolutionary disruption and fervor, but is quickly put aside and then gives way often to some authoritarian vanguardist system. So the second point of departure, and in a sense it's the institutional equivalent to the first point of departure, is the only institutional point of departure can be what exists, the actual institutions of representative democracy. It's not the point of arrival, but it's the point of departure. It's where we start. It's what history gives us. And that alternative of saying, let's overcome representative democracy and let's have direct participatory democracy is just this dream, this diversion, which is preventing us from dealing with the task of transforming what we have in the first moment. So that's what I want to take as the points of departure. Now, my next claim is this. All of the democracies that exist in the world are weak or flawed democracies. And they're weak in several senses. First, they're weak because they make the transformation of the structure anomalous, exceptional. The law that these democracies produce is a series of episodic interventions in an inherited structure, the real opaque structure of society. And the law is like a series of occasional or episodic interventions in this received mass. Now, right there's a problem, because if democracy is anything, democracy should mean that the terms of social life are chosen by us individually and collectively. They're not just imposed by power, by influence, by tradition, by the past. We choose them. The second sense in which these are weak democracies is that in all of them, change continues to depend on crisis. There has to be an exogenous shock. And the canonical form of the exogenous shock is war or ruin, an economic collapse or a military conflict. And the rule in all of these democracies is no trauma, no transformation. The third sense in which they are weak democracies is that they therefore all perpetuate the rule of the living by the dead. In all of these democracies, the dead continue to rule us. That's why, for example, Thomas Jefferson, one of the revered founders, proposed that the Constitution of the United States should be trashed every 2.5 generations, because he wanted to prevent the dead from ruling the living. So they're weak democracies in all of these senses. Now, what would be needed in order to replace weak democracies by high-energy democracies, strong democracies? And I'm going to claim that there would be 3, and later I'll say 5 sets of crucial institutional innovations. And this is then the institutional program of the deepening of democracy, which is the political counterpart to the program of the democratization of the market order, which we have just discussed. So the first set of innovations has to do with the temperature of politics. By the temperature of politics, I mean the level of organized popular engagement in political life. And my basic intuition or idea is that only a high temperature politics can be structurally fertile, rich in the creation of structural alternatives. Now, a central tenet of conservative political science is that there's a tension between political institutionalization and political mobilization. For example, this was the idea of Samuel Huntington, conservative American political science. Institutionalization and mobilization are in tension with each other. And you could extend that idea into the following contrast. Politics must be either cold and institutional or hot and anti or extra institutional. So at the end of the day, there's Madison on one side, and there's Caesarism, or Mussolini on the other side. And you have to choose which you want, Madison or Mussolini. Now, my central contention about this first set of innovations is that you don't have to choose between Madison and Mussolini. You can have a politics that is hot and institutional at the same time. And political arrangements differ significantly in their temperature, in the extent to which they support and sustain organized popular engagement in political life. And notice I'm saying this as someone who just a moment ago said that in Constant's distinction between the liberty of the moderns and the liberty of the ancients, I took the side of the liberty of the moderns, but now I want to transform it step by step. So then we have to ask, what are the institutional changes that raise this temperature institutionally? And they devolve into a series of details. So first, the rules governing the relation of money to politics, like political activity has to be financed publicly, not privately. The rules governing the relation of politics to the media. Television time can't be bought. It has to be attributed for free to the political parties and organized social movements as a condition for the maintenance of the revocable licenses under which the media companies do their business. Or you might say, voting. Voting has to be mandatory, as it is in many democracies in the world, both rich and poor. And electoral regimes. The mobilizational effect of electoral regimes cannot be treated as an a priori, as a uniform fact. For example, in a country that has first past the post-majoritarian voting, like the United States, the adoption of proportional representation can have a mobilizational effect. But in a country like Italy, that has many political parties and proportional representation, the adoption of majoritarian voting is what can have a mobilizational effect. So the effect of electoral regimes is highly contextual and should not be treated as any kind of universal. But it is then the combined and cumulative effect of interventions like these that I've just enumerated, which raises the temperature and produces a more mobilizational politics, a politics that is hot but institutional. Now we come to the second set of innovations. The second set of innovations has to do with the pace of politics. So the objective is not just to raise the temperature, but second, to hasten the pace. On the political equivalent to Popper's principle that in science the aim is to make mistakes as quickly as possible, under democracy also, and accelerate, and ensure that each party can try out its ideas decisively rather than be able to say later on, our ideas were never really tried out. These are just our second best ideas. That's what they all say. So we'll hasten the pace. Now, let's take the example of the United States, which squarely presents this problem. There's in the constitutional arrangements of the United States, which in the late 18th century were a kind of proto-democratic liberalism, right? It was not a democracy. Many qualifications to the suffrage, for example, property qualifications also. There is a liberal principle of the fragmentation of power. There are many sources of power in the state. And there was a conservative principle of the slowing down of politics. That's Madison's scheme of checks and balances. And the Americans believe, mistakenly, that the liberal and the conservative principles are naturally and necessarily wedded to each other. They're not. They are married to each other by intention and design to produce a certain effect, which is the effect of inhibiting the transformation of society by politics. And we can easily imagine reaffirming the liberal principle but repudiating the conservative one. How would we do that in the tripartite state like the American system? We would say, for example, if there is an impasse between the two political branches, the presidency, the president and the Congress, either branch will unilaterally have the prerogative to call early elections to dissolve the impasse. But the elections will always be bilateral for both branches. So the branch that exercises the constitutional prerogative will have to pay the political price of running the electoral risk. And that would be a simple way of transforming the presidential regime into a machine for the acceleration of politics, even though it was designed as a way of slowing politics down. And you can imagine also comprehensive programmatic plebiscites, not single-issue plebiscites and referenda, but there's an impasse and there's a choice of direction. The directions are described, and then there's a national vote, a national debate, and a national vote. So the general aim is to hasten the pace and decide everything quickly. Now comes a third set of institutions or innovations. And this has to do with the relation between the center and the periphery. In federations, but also in unitary states. So the conservative conventional view is that there's a pendular swing, an opposition between power to the center and power to the localities. That there's just a flat contradiction. But it's relatively easy to imagine a system in which, by the design of divided and concurrent powers in a federation, for example, you can strengthen central action and devolution, deviation of the localities from the national solutions at the same time. So the general idea is this. As a country goes down a certain road, choosing decisive programs, it hedges its bets by allowing parts of itself to deviate from the dominant national solutions and to generate counter models of the national future. So the counter model, to be effective, to be potent, the counter models can't be just ideas, abstractions. They have to be tangible examples. They have to be acted out. And that's what they would represent. So now, of course, taking the example of the United States, we know there is a formidable history of states' rights, and states' rights have been used to entrench persecution, racial and class oppression. So the use of this power to deviate would have to be vetted both politically by the political branches of government and judicially by the jurists, by the courts, to prevent such abuse. But you could say that this would be the general objective, and this idea then could develop in two stages. In the first stage, the emphasis would be on cooperative federalism. So cooperation is vertical among the three levels of a federation and horizontal among the states and among the municipalities. They form regional coalitions, for example, as they have begun to do in the United States. And then the second level is the level of what I want to call very wide divergence. So part of the country can appeal for a right to diverge very widely. So notice that in a federation, the presumption is that all the parts of the federation enjoy simultaneously the same level of divergence. Because, and so long as you insist on the presumption of uniformity of divergence, divergence can never be very wide. It can only be very wide if you allow for an exceptionally wide divergence in particular cases. That is actually easier to do in unitary states than in federations. So in unitary states like Britain or France, you can imagine that a part of the country is allowed to diverge very widely, and that same right is not then given to another part of the country. So Britain can make a deal with Scotland different from the deal that it makes with Wales, for example. And that's easier to implement and even imagine in a unitary state than it is in a federation. But that's the general idea of this divergence, because then you have in a country a powerful direction embodied, but at the same time contradictions to it. Huh? And the level of experimentalism then rises in the whole country through this dialectic between the main model and the counterparts or the counterpoint to it. Now, here's a fourth problem, which is of a completely different kind. So there should be in the state a power to come to the rescue of a social group which finds itself imprisoned in a circumstance of disadvantage or subjugation from which it is unable to escape by the forms of collective political and economic action that are readily available to it. And so there has to be a way of going into that part of society and reshaping it to allow them to escape. So in the existing form of the state, there's no part of the state that is equipped to do that, because if it's structural, it's not appropriate for the executive. If it's particular, as opposed to being universal, it's not appropriate for the legislature. And if it's reconstructive, rather than just declaratory, it's not appropriate for the judiciary. So what has happened? I want to give an example now from the United States. So this activity that I'm describing as a theory, in fact, exists. It exists in the United States in the form of the so-called structural injunctions or complex enforcement. The federal judiciary, at least in a certain period of recent American history, goes into a social organization like a school system, a system of mental asylums, a prison system, and it says, this system as it's presently constituted is imposing a form of subjugation or disadvantage which is intolerable by the law. So it attributes to the law a large principled orientation. It's an idealization of the law. And on the basis of that idealization, it says the law contradicts the power structure in this particular part of social life. So then they invent a new kind of adjudication. So the traditional idea of adjudication is the parties are individuals. The evil that is to be redressed is a violation of some particular right. And the remedy is to restore the original right against the violation. Now you have a different idea. The parties are collective. The evil is the contradiction of some part of social life or some organization to an ideal imputed to the law. And the remedy is the reconstruction of a part of social life, a particular organization. That's what the structural injunctions do. And now what happened in the United States was there was no part of the government that was ideally equipped or legitimized to do this work. So the federal judges, during the epoch in which the progressives dominated the federal judiciary, showed up and they said, we'll do it. And they then began to do it until they ran out of power. So in other words, you can't there's no reason why they couldn't have continued. For example, why they couldn't do this activity of the structural injunctions to the banks, to finance, rather than just to mental asylums and prisons. Why just to the marginalized peripheral parts of society? Why not to the central parts? And the answer is that wouldn't be tolerated, of course. They were non-elected officials. There was no basis on which they could claim to have that power. So it's like there were two principles that were underlying this. There was one which says, suppose there's a transformative task authorized by the law, but there's no appropriate institutional role agent for it. You do it anyway. Even though there's no role agent, you seize on the inappropriate role agent and you use it incongruously. The corresponding principle was, no, you only implement a transformative task when there is the appropriate role agent for it. Now, what did the Americans do? The American judiciary, it just split the difference between these two principles. It's not that they disregarded the questions of institutional propriety, but they didn't allow the questions of institutional propriety to have a definitive influence. They just split the difference. So, what am I saying? I'm saying that this is an example of how this task arises in a contemporary democracy. There's a class societies. They're filled with all sorts of racial or class oppression. And there may be need then to invade the causal background of society and begin to change it. To the extent necessary to release that group from the circumstance of subjugation from which it finds itself unable to escape. And that would require a different power in the state, a different branch of government. It might be co-elected by the other branches of government or chosen in some other way, financed with its own capabilities and its own technical powers to do this reconstructive but localized work. And in the real situation of history, you start the way the Americans did. You don't start with the ideal role or power in the state. You start with a task. And then an inappropriate agent does it, like the American judges. And then later on, you would have to find the appropriate agent. The role agent would have to be created retrospectively if the role agent doesn't exist antecedently. Now finally, my fifth innovation has to do with that second point of departure. So the relation of representative democracy to direct democracy. We can't replace representative democracy by direct or participatory democracy. But we can deepen representative democracy. We can enrich it progressively with traits of direct or participatory democracy. So for example, comprehensive programmatic plebiscites at the national level. In local government, participatory budgeting, participation of the citizens in direct self-government at the local level. And then little by little, we begin to marry traits of direct and participatory democracy to the institutions of representative democracy. So we're not casting aside representative democracy, but we are changing its color, its temperature, by letting it take on some of the traits of representative democracy. So those 5 sets of innovations that I've just described define what I want to take as the direction of a high-energy democracy. And by the tests that I cited at the outset, that they allow us greater power over the established structure, They don't force us to take the established structure on a take it or leave it basis. They increase our power to choose what we want. They diminish the dependence of change on crisis, and they overthrow the rule of the living by the dead. So your comments? Yes.
Well, listening to these 5 measures, number 4 seems different, at least to me, from the rest.
Yes, it is different.
But in an important way, in that I'm not sure how it's connected with the goal of achieving a high energy democracy.
Well, let me say a word about that. So, these flawed democracies that exist in the world exist all in the context of class societies. And in principle, there should be a contradiction. There is a contradiction between class society and democracy. So, the nature of class society is that the life chances of individuals are powerfully shaped by the differential transmission of economic and educational advantage through the family. And that's incompatible with the promise of democracy in a higher way. So so we have to now distinguish the way in which this problem was addressed in the United States and in the rest of the world. In the United States, the problem was addressed by more and more ambitious interpretations of general constitutional principles, like equal protection. And of course, the characteristic way in which the Americans changed their constitution is by pretending that it means something different from what it was previously thought to mean, rather than by amending it outright. In the rest of the world, that's not how they do things. Now, this American method has significant structural implications because it's easy to pretend that equal protection or due process means something different from what it was thought to mean before. But it's not easy to pretend that when the Constitution says there are 3 branches of government, what it really means is that there are 5 branches of government. So in other words, the discriminate setup of the government is not an easy object for this exercise in reinterpretation, which applies much more readily to the understanding of principles of rights than to the actual setup of the state. Now, in the rest of the world, what happened is that they do change their constitutions there. They change them all the time. And many countries have large numbers of constitutions. But starting with the Weimar Constitution after the First World War, the world began to fill up the constitutions of the states of the world with promises of rights. So it indirectly responded to this problem of the contradiction between democracy and class society by promising all these rights. So rights to everything. General rights like dignity, happiness, and so forth, but very particular rights. You will have free health care. You'll have free housing. You'll have a wonderful education, all for free, and so forth. All of these promises to no effect. That is, there's no institutional engineering in these constitutions that would implement these promises of rights. So they're broken promises, failed promises. So this question remains of the contradiction between the principles of democracy and class society. So in this circumstance, which is the real circumstance, the situation that I described will arise. There will be groups in society that cannot escape from a circumstance of subjugation or disadvantage in which they find themselves by the forms of collective political and economic action that are available to them. So then the idea is, it's not enough to raise the temperature, hasten the pace, combine strong central action with radical devolution as a whole. We must come to the rescue of these particular groups. And both the American strategy of fanciful reinterpretation of the constitutional principles and the strategy in the rest of the world of filling the constitutions with promises of rights are not realistic, adequate responses to this problem. So that's the source of the idea. And that's how it fits into the other principles. That it says that given the social the social context in which these weak democracies exist, the innovations announced in the 3 sets of innovations are not enough. And they have to be supplemented by this rescue operation. That the democracy has to be equipped with means to change the structure of society piece by piece. And not allow a circumstance in which citizenship cannot be effectively exercised by part of the population.
And are you suggesting then that the appropriate agent for this piecemeal change is a non-democratic, non-political branch of government, such as the judiciary? Is that the role that structural injunctions are supposed to play?
No, I
What
think
should that
so. I think that this, if you like, this 4th branch of government, this other power in the state, where the state is not divided in the tripartite fashion, this other part of the state would have a task that is structural but localized. And that particular combination makes it inappropriate for the judiciary, for the legislature, and for the executive. The judiciary also is not supposed to be dealing with structural reorganization. It's supposed to be reestablishing broken situations of right. Now here it's saying that there's this contradiction between the right, as understood by this ambitious idealization of law in the language of policy and principle, and a particular organization. But why do they stop where they stop? Why do they stop with prisons and school systems? Why don't they go on? Go on to the banks, to finance. We were discussing finance earlier in the class. Of course, they don't do that. And there's no principled reason, as far as I can tell, why they won't do that. They won't do that because it wouldn't be allowed. It wouldn't be tolerated. Then they'd be going off the deep end. They'd be stopped. So in other words, for this task of change that is structural but localized to be adequately exercised without arbitrary and ad hoc forms of truncation, it has to have an agent equipped to do it and legitimated to do it for this purpose. And that agent doesn't exist. So in the situation in which the agent doesn't exist, what may happen is what has happened in the United States. One of the existing inappropriate agents comes up and says, I'll do it. And why will he do it? Because he wants to do it. And they let him get away with it for a while. Then, as we've seen with the political influence on the judiciary in the United States, the empire strikes back, right? So the progressives dominate the federal judiciary for a while, and then they stop dominating it. But they were able to do that for a while, at least. That was the heyday of complex enforcement and of the structural injunctions. So rather than this subject being left, as it were, to the sidelines, and having as its beneficiaries these secondary or peripheral organizations, bring it to the center by this task. That's the logic. So I understand why you say the 4th is very different in nature from the other 3, but it's because of the impurity of the context or the circumstance. So democracy, weak democracy, exists in the context of class society. Class society in principle is incompatible with democracy, but it does exist. And so there has to be some accommodation, which is as ad hoc as the circumstances, to deal with this contradiction between democracy and its social context. Yes?
So, 2 examples come to mind following up on the question. In case of politics, one in politics and one in finance that we were discussing earlier. In the case of politics, the carve-outs that are made in democracies today for tribal governance, for some tribes within the state structure giving autonomous authority comes to mind as possible. Is that
Yes.
a good example? And the other one in finance is the special economic zone or the financial centers, which have a different regulatory regime. They both seem to be carve-outs.
Well, the question of the tribes is now, what was the second one you said?
The second one was in finance, the special economic zones or financial centers, which have their own regulations. They both seem to be these kind of
Well,
carve-outs.
that's a different kind of carve-out. That's second, right? I mean, there the idea is you'd have a place where you could experiment. In a way, it's related to the argument about federalism and why divergence, right? You have a zone where things can be organized differently from how they're organized in the country as a whole. Because you have an interest in allowing the country to hedge its bets, as I said. It goes down a certain road, but let's have a different vision of the national future in a particular sector or in a particular part. The issue of the tribes is very interesting because it raises other sets of questions. So we, for example, have this problem in Brazil. So we have a sparse Indian population over a huge amount of land. And so in the Amazon, which the Brazilian Amazon is larger than Western Europe, 21% of the land is reserved to the Indians. And so it's a vast amount of land. It's larger than many European countries. But at the same time, we deny economic and educational resources to the Indians. So predictably, they're sinking in alcoholism, depression, disintegration, etc. A great calamity befell the Indians when the Jesuits were succeeded by the anthropologists as their mentors and defenders. You know? Because the anthropologists speak for a heresy in Western civilization. It's not just a distinct social science. It's a different spiritual view. The heresy is this idea that the cultures, the collective cultures of the world are the real protagonists in world history. And they must be preserved no matter what. Now, we in the West don't think that way. What we think is that all the cultures in the world should be smashed. Iconoclasm is the impulse. That's how we come closer to God. And the Indians are no exception to that. They shouldn't be treated as if they were in some timeless paradise. They should be brought into history together with us. We don't want to view them differently from how we view ourselves. So we then have this task of how we can give them access to the economic and educational resources that they need to prevent the social disaster that they're in. But the resources have to be provided in a way that is compatible with their degree of isolation. So some of them have opted to integrate into Brazilian society. Others remain almost completely isolated. So the way of providing access has to take into account this prior collective choice about integration or isolation. But now we have a second level of problem, which is the individual Indian, the young Indian, who is against his tribe, right? Who's trying to create trouble in his tribe and change it radically, is a citizen of the Republic. And the Republic has to stand by that young person in his opposition to his tribe. So that complicates the calculus then. We can't just stand aside as the anthropologists want us to and say, these are fossils in a museum, this is real life. And these people are exercising their freedom. And if he wants to be an iconoclast, we have to defend his right to exercise his iconoclasm. So that's a complication. So I'm not sure how I would relate that to this debate about democracy, but it seems to deal with all of these other questions about the creation of difference. the prophetic mission that we all have under democracy. Yes.
So I want to go back to your first thesis, where you talk about how to raise the temperature in politics, and part of that, of course, is limiting the ability of private financing of campaigns, especially using personal assets, right? And so I'm curious to what extent that thesis is altered or affected by the presidential campaign of Michael Bloomberg. He spends $500 million, basically takes over the internet with advertisements, and is utterly crushed in the Democratic primary. And so I'm curious about how that.
Well, what are you saying? That money is therefore less important than it seems to be, or what?
That's what I'm asking. I'm wondering if
No,
that is
I think it's very
conclusion that we
important.
come to
It's
from
very
that.
important.
Or if it isn't, then why was that experience so different?
Well, you remember Ross Perot saying when he was a candidate that he was willing to spend up to 5% of his fortune to become president of the United States. so this just shows you the relative hierarchy of private and public interest. No, it's the use of private wealth to conquer political power is absurd. The Supreme Court said money talks, so defending this as part of the First Amendment. My colleague Paul Freund said, I thought that was the problem, right? And so, and that's what's involved. It's incompatible with democracy, but it's another facet of this contradiction between democracy and class society. So they are class societies. There are these tremendous differences of wealth. So are the asset holders then entitled to in fact co-opt or buy their fellow citizens? That's what we have to prevent.
Yeah, but that goes back to my question, though. I mean, Michael Bloomberg tried to buy.
And he failed, yes, but he could have won. He could have succeeded. And the mere attempt to do so seems to me very troubling.
Okay, I see the distinction.
Yeah,
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Professor.
sure. Any other comments or questions? All right, so have a very good spring recess.
Classes, we have the same plan,
Same route.
same route. We should be friends.
Now what just happened?
How are you doing? Very good. Don't be upset, man.
I'm not as. I already bought it. I was already here.
Sort of blended in the sense that
I wrote the best brief of all time. But the italicized is not. And.
You have the answer. Because it's your
See you around tomorrow then.
He's feeling left out.
Ah, he should, yeah. Why have you not been democratic in your...
Sandal.
इसको नहीं लगा?
इसका देख लिया।
मैं मिल जाता हूँ क्यों?
तुम्हें संगी बनाना है।
मुझे बीजेपी नहीं बनना है।
You're not... He's worried about Odisha politics.
What is the politics? Odisha politics aligns with whoever comes in. Simple.
You should have potato chips. It's good for you. That's okay.
Yeah, you got two packs.
That's
Very good. It's the best thing to eat.
Yeah.
Without potato chips, you're nowhere.
You're nowhere. You're sad. Nowhere. Good diet.
Ask him as
Especially you're going to the school of hypocrites. So which one you have to?
No, I've already graduated from there.
Hypocrites.
I have a PhD from that school.
Scoundrels. HKS is that only. Harvard, MUD.
Enjoy your moment in the sun.
Why are you sitting here? Do nothing can be said for that now.
What? For what?
चाहिए for धूप
धूप इतनी अच्छी है बाहर भी है पर बाहर ठंडी है